At 8:47 a.m., December 14th, 1944, snow drifted sideways across the Ardennes like shredded paper from a burning city. The forest was all white silence and distant artillery echoes when Private First Class Vincent Hayes slid behind a low stone wall glazed in frost. His fingers were numb, his breath thick enough to hang in the air. He pressed his cheek against the cold stock of his M1 Garand and watched shadows begin to form through the tree line 400 yards away. Shapes merged, split, reorganized. German infantry, dozens, maybe more behind them. He counted 37 before he stopped trying. He had 8 rounds, 8 tiny chances, 8 drops of hope in a rising tide of iron. The machine gun nest that should have been guarding this sector had fallen silent more than 3 minutes earlier. Hayes didn't need to check what that meant. Sergeant Whitmore and his men were gone, their bodies somewhere among the shredded sandbags and smoking earth. Hayes was alone. Company B was falling back, scattered, broken apart by the speed and violence of the German push. And in the freezing quiet of that ruined farm lane, Hayes realized something with terrifying clarity. In the next 90 seconds, he was going to do something no manual allowed. Something every officer he'd ever spoken to would have shut down instantly. Something so reckless, so off doctrine, he would have been court-martialed for even suggesting it during training. Yet it would save lives. And kill 19 enemy soldiers before the minute hand moved again. He hadn't always been the kind of soldier who broke rules. Back in Pittsburgh's South Side, long before Europe, long before dead friends and collapsing front lines, Hayes had been good at exactly 2 things: climbing structures no sane person climbed, and moving through industrial skeletons like he'd been born inside them. His father had worked 23 brutal years in the Jones and Laughlin steel mill before the furnace accident took his legs. Vincent grew up wandering through rusted catwalks, steel beams, overhead gantries, spaces that terrified other kids but made perfect sense to him. Elevation was instinct, not training. Balance was muscle memory. Danger was just the price of perspective. Summers with his uncle, a roofer, sharpened that instinct. Slanted surfaces, ice-slick shingles, sweating tar in July heat. He learned to trust angles, to feel weight distribution through his boots, to move where others hesitated. Later, when he enlisted at 20, the recruiter barely listened when Hayes tried to explain the skill set. Steelwork and roofing, Hayes said. Rifleman, the recruiter answered. That was that. From then on, the Army told him where to stand, how to kneel, how to press his cheek against a rifle stock at textbook angles. He qualified expert marksman, outshot half the company. But something deep inside him kept whispering that the doctrine didn't fit the battlefield he knew. Combat wasn't a training course, it was improvisation. It was unpredictability, and it punished predictability without mercy. France proved that. He watched Danny Sullivan die because a manual told him where to lie behind a stone wall. He watched Corporal Ridley follow protocol into a foxhole that a mortar crew already had ranged in. He watched Lieutenant Brennan kneel exactly where a diagram in the handbook said a squad leader should. All 3 died exactly where the Germans expected American riflemen to be. Hayes held their bodies, closed their eyes, collected their effects, wrote final notes to family members he would never meet. And with each death, a seed of quiet rebellion grew inside him. Don't stand where they expect. Don't fire from where the manual says. Don't move like a diagram. By autumn, Company B had lost 40-plus men. Replacements came, fresh, naive, unscarred. They followed doctrine with perfect precision, and most of them died within weeks. Hayes began to understand something the officers never saw. The Germans scanned horizontally. They checked ground-level cover, tree trunks, foxholes, stone walls. They memorized American habits, but they almost never look up. Elevated positions were unpredictable. Dangerous, yes, but unpredictable. And unpredictability buys seconds. Seconds save lives. Now, crouched behind the cold stone wall with a freezing rifle and a forest full of Germans advancing, Hayes knew the ground was death. Doctrine was death. Doing what he was trained to do was death. He glanced toward the abandoned farmhouse to his right, the one he'd silently scouted 2 nights earlier. Stone walls, steep slate roof, attic window facing east. Perfect elevation, perfect angle, perfect risk. He exhaled. Then he ran. The farmhouse door resisted for half a second before the swollen wood gave way under his shoulder. The inside smelled of cold stone and old grain, the stale breath of a building long abandoned. Hayes didn't bother clearing rooms. He didn't have the seconds to spare. Boots hammered the wooden floorboards as he sprinted for the attic stairs, the sound too loud, too revealing, but there was no alternative. The Germans would reach the outer yard any moment. If they caught him on the climb, it was over. Halfway up, he felt the vibration of distant footfalls through the timber frame, enemy soldiers, closing in. Unaware, an American rifleman was about to break every rule they assumed he followed. Hayes' breath echoed in the cramped stairwell, white clouds trailing behind him as he shoved open the attic door. Dust exploded into the air, glittering in the thin sliver of winter light. The space was cramped, full of rafters, webs, and the skeletal remains of old furniture. But Hayes didn't look at any of it. He went straight to the window he had quietly tested 2 nights earlier. The latch stuck, but he forced it open. Cold air slapped his face, biting, electric, and he caught the faint smell of cordite drifting from the tree line. He climbed through. The slate roof was slick with a skin of frost, but the texture was familiar, just like the roofing tiles in Pittsburgh winters when he'd climbed to replace ice-damaged sections for his uncle. The angle of the pitch was steep, nearly 45 degrees. Any other soldier would have hesitated. Hayes didn't. He flattened himself low, sliding into position like it was second nature. His boots jammed into the seam where 2 slate panels met. His left shoulder braced against the chimney, the coarse stone digging into his jacket. He locked himself into the angle like a puzzle piece snapping into place. Below him, the world opened. The forest edge stretched out like a white and black battlefield map. The Germans were moving in small teams, advancing in confidence because they believed the machine gun had been neutralized, the Americans routed. Hayes counted again, 37 visible, maybe more behind the trees. He could pick out a junior officer directing movements, waving his men into spread formations. They weren't rushing, they were preparing for a methodical sweep. They had no idea a rifle muzzle was already aimed down from a line they never expected. Hayes steadied his breathing. The cold tried to make his hands tremble, but he forced control back into his fingers. 8 rounds. That was the ugly truth. 8 rounds for 37 enemies. Even with a perfect angle, numbers didn't lie. He'd have 1 reload, 2 if he moved fast enough and luck stayed with him. He pressed the front side of the Garand onto the officer's chest. For a moment, the world felt impossibly still. No wind, no voices, just the thin whistle of blood in his ears and the weight of months of anger, loss, and frustration pressing forward through the barrel of his rifle. He squeezed the trigger. The officer collapsed instantly. The line of German soldiers froze, confused, eyes sweeping tree lines, windows, ditches. Just like Hayes predicted, horizontal scanning, always horizontal. Their hesitation was small, 2 seconds at most, but in a firefight, 2 seconds was an eternity. Hayes fired again. A rifleman spun backwards into the snow. Another dove for cover behind a stump that offered nothing against a downward angle. Hayes worked the trigger cleanly, each shot deliberate. His training said never to fire rapidly from an unstable position, but the roof wasn't unstable for him. It was his world, his element. Below, the Germans began shouting, their movements jagged, inconsistent, panicked. Some tried to trace the shots, but their eyes kept sweeping at the wrong elevation. Hayes felt the roof vibrate beneath him as the heat of action pushed adrenaline into his veins. 7 rounds fired, 1 left. He adjusted slightly, boots grinding into frozen slate, the chimney digging harder into his shoulder. The last shot dropped a soldier who had broken into a sprint. Ping. The empty clip jumped free, that metallic signature that every soldier knew and every enemy recognized. Now they would look up. Now the real danger began. Hayes didn't waste a second. He reached into his belt pouch, hands moving with the speed of muscle memory. Snow swirled across the roof in thin spirals as he slammed a fresh clip into the Garand. Below him, a German finally spotted the movement on the roof and shouted. Hayes exhaled, brought the rifle back up, and re-engaged. He'd stepped completely outside the manual, and the manual had no idea what to do with someone like him. The shout rose from the tree line like a crack of warning, sharp, panicked, and unmistakably directed at him. Hayes didn't need to understand German to know what it meant. He'd been seen. The roof that had been his advantage a minute earlier was seconds from becoming a coffin lid. But the moment the Germans finally looked up, they realized something far worse. He already had the angle. And angles decide battles. He sighted the nearest target, a soldier trying to get behind the charred remains of a felled oak. From the ground, that stump was cover. From the roof, it was nothing but a half-circle of exposed uniform. Hayes squeezed the trigger. The soldier collapsed before his shoulder even touched the wood. The Germans scattered, but scattering meant movement, and movement on white snow against a dark forest was a death sentence when viewed from elevation. Hayes tracked another, a man breaking left, sprinting low, trying to disappear into brush. He led the shot the way he'd learned to lead swinging hooks on the steel mill cranes as a kid. Same rhythm, same instinct. He fired. The man spun sideways and dropped face first into the snow. He didn't celebrate hits. There was no time, no satisfaction, only calculation. A bullet slammed into the chimney beside his head, spraying grit into his hair. Another punched into the slate inches from his ribs. The Germans had finally found the angle. What they lacked in elevation, they were making up for in volume. Semi-automatic rifles cracked, a machine pistol chattered. A rifle round ricocheted off the peak of the roof with a scream like tearing metal. Hayes ducked, sliding lower along the slope, keeping his profile tight, compact, almost level with the slates. He could feel each impact through the structure, small vibrations, lethal reminders. But they were firing wildly, desperately. Shooting up at a target on a roof meant fighting gravity itself. Their rounds lost speed, accuracy, punch. His didn't. He rose just enough to see over the ridge and fired again. Another enemy fell. The Germans stopped advancing. They began pulling back toward the trees, hugging trunks, shouting to each other, trying to form a firing line. Hayes watched them reorganize, watched the way fear distorted their movements. They weren't retreating, they were recalibrating, adjusting for a threat they hadn't trained for. Their minds were catching up to what was happening. An American rifleman was above them, firing down from a steep roof, using an angle none of their doctrine accounted for. Hayes reloaded again, faster this time. Hands trembling from the cold, yes, but steady from purpose. The second clip locked in with a satisfying weight. He pressed his cheek back to the stock and took aim at a pair of soldiers crouched behind a fallen tree trunk. On the ground, that trunk was solid cover. From the roof, all he saw were 2 helmets and 2 shoulders. He fired twice. Both helmets dropped. More screams came from the tree line. One soldier pointed at the roof, another frantically waved his arms, shouting for suppressing fire. Rounds clattered against slate. A bullet skipped upward, buzzing past Hayes' ear like an angry hornet. He ducked again, breathing hard. Snow dusted across his hands. His pulse thudded in his temples. He risked a glance downward. 3 German bodies near the stump, 2 by the fallen trunk, 1 by the tree line. Another sprawled beside a shattered fence post. They formed a scattered trail of dark shapes on white ground, proof that the angle worked, proof that unpredictability could break the rhythm of an entire assault. 7 more rounds left in the clip. He forced himself to breathe slow, steady. Every breath felt like inhaling ice. Every exhale formed a cloud that could reveal his exact position. But he had to see the battlefield clearly. Movement flickered near the far right of the tree line. 2 soldiers were crawling toward a ruined tractor, trying to set up an MG-34. Hayes felt a cold pinch of urgency. If they got that machine gun braced, elevation wouldn't save him. That weapon could chew through slate, wood, and bone in a heartbeat. Hayes adjusted his aim. They were low, smart, using shadows, trying to stay invisible. But from up here, shadows didn't matter. He fired. The gunner jerked backward. Fired again. The assistant dropped beside him. The machine gun never fired a round. Hayes sank back behind the chimney, chest heaving, snow clinging to his jacket, fingertips stiff from cold and recoil. He'd already lost count of how many he'd hit. 11, 12, 14 maybe? It didn't matter. What mattered was that the German advance had stalled, completely. A single rifleman with elevation had thrown their entire assault off balance. But the battle wasn't over, not even close. Because deeper in the forest, Hayes could hear something new. Heavy boots moving, coordinated, disciplined, reinforcements, a second wave. And this time, they were coming straight for him. The men on the ground had no idea how close death was. Because 40 feet above them, on that rust-colored tin roof, a young American marksman was finally beginning to understand the angle everyone had rejected. He steadied his breathing. The metal under his elbows felt warm from the sun, vibrating with every shot fired in the distance. Then, he saw movement. A German squad cutting across a narrow alley between 2 collapsed buildings. 19 men, moving fast, stacked tight, perfectly exposed from above. But only from this angle. He exhaled. For the first time, the tin roof theory didn't feel crazy. It felt like destiny. His rifle locked, his eyes sharpened. His world shrank to a single trigger pull. And then, crack. The first German dropped instantly. But the others didn't scatter. They didn't understand where the shot came from. They thought it was artillery, debris, anything except a lone American lying invisible above them. That mistake, that split-second confusion, gave him the deadliest 14 seconds of his life. The alley below erupted into chaos, but not fast enough. Because from that tin roof, he had the God angle. A bird's-eye view in a war fought at eye level. He shifted just an inch, just enough to line up the next target. Crack. A second man folded. The Germans finally realized something was wrong, but they still couldn't locate him. The echo off the tin roof warped the sound. It bounced through the ruins like a ghost. Third shot. Fourth. Fifth. each one landing with clinical precision. Below him, the squad broke apart, but too late. Some dove behind debris, others crawled for cover, but every position they took was visible from the rooftop. He wasn't fighting them, he was hunting them. The sergeant later said it felt like death was falling from the sky. 7 seconds in, 9 men were gone. 10 seconds, 12 men. 14 seconds, 19 German soldiers lay silent in that narrow alley. Each hit clean, each hit from an angle they never expected. When his rifle finally went quiet, the battlefield did too. For the first time, the commanders understood. The tin roof angle wasn't just a tactic. It was a force multiplier, and it had turned one American soldier into a one-man front line. When the gunfire died, he stayed still, breathing slow, heart pounding, cheek pressed against the rifle stock. Below him, the alley looked unreal. 19 bodies, all fallen in a perfect broken line, a line only he could have seen from above. Minutes later, the American platoon moved in. They expected enemy fire, ambush, resistance. Instead, they found silence. That's when the lieutenant finally looked up and saw him on the roof, a lone shadow against the smoke-filled sky. At first, nobody understood what happened. 19 kills? One shooter? From that flimsy tin sheet that rattled in the wind? The same idea they had rejected? Impossible. But then they checked the angles, the impacts, the downward entry wounds, the tight grouping. Every detail matched only one explanation. The tin roof angle worked, and it had just changed the entire operation. The commanders who had laughed at the idea earlier walked toward the building in complete silence now. Because this wasn't luck, this wasn't a fluke. This was a sniper who had redefined the battlefield by climbing somewhere no one else thought to go. And deep down, every officer there knew, if he could do this from one rooftop, imagine what an entire unit trained in this angle could accomplish. The war had just gained a new weapon, a new tactic, and it was born from a rusted piece of tin. The aftermath of the shots felt surreal. Snow swirled over the lifeless bodies below, carrying with it the smell of cold, spent gunpowder and the faint copper tang of blood. Hayes stayed low, heart still hammering, eyes scanning the tree line for any movement, any indication that more German soldiers had survived. The silence was deafening. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the weight of what had just happened, the kind of moment that carved itself into memory. The platoon began to regroup. Soldiers cautiously approached the alley, rifles at the ready, eyes darting to every shadow. They expected resistance, ambush, a last desperate counterattack, but there was nothing. The 19 enemy soldiers lay exactly where Hayes had placed them. The line was so perfect it seemed almost unreal, as if someone had frozen a photograph in mid-battle. Commanders emerged from the ruined building across the street, eyes wide, mouths barely moving. Some shook their heads, unwilling to believe what they were seeing. Others didn't shake at all, they just stared. The calculation, precision, and audacity of that single rifleman were beyond comprehension. Hayes finally moved from the rooftop, sliding down carefully along the slope. Every step was deliberate, every footfall measured. The risk wasn't over. He had to descend the attic stairs without announcing his position to any stragglers, any hidden enemy who might have survived the initial engagement. He reached the floor, heart still racing, and exhaled, a cloud of frosty air escaping his lips. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to glance at the rifle. Still warm, still deadly. It had served him well, every bullet finding its mark. His mind was not on glory, not on recognition, not even on the lives he had saved. His mind was already calculating what could happen next, what might still be waiting in the shadows of the Ardennes Forest. The officers gathered around, whispering urgently among themselves. For the first time, Hayes felt a shift. The men who had dismissed his rooftops, mocked his stupid angles, and scorned his intuition were no longer laughing. They were studying him, analyzing him, trying to extract from his actions a formula they could understand. But some things could not be taught. Some things were instinct, born of steel mills, roofs, and years of moving in ways others couldn't imagine. The soldiers who survived the German push began murmuring to each other, disbelief mixing with awe. They spoke of the sheer bravery, the improbable skill, the audacity required to expose oneself on a steep roof in the middle of a winter offensive. Every man in Company B who had watched the battle unfold understood something fundamental. The battlefield had changed. A single soldier could influence an entire engagement if he thought beyond doctrine, beyond regulation, beyond fear. Hayes had become a force multiplier, not because of orders or superior numbers, but because he had trusted experience over instruction. He had trusted instinct over protocol. Even the Germans, regrouping deeper in the forest, would later report the encounter. Accounts filtered through intelligence channels: an American sniper, unseen, elevated, lethal. A force that disrupted their advance, forced hesitation, and inflicted significant casualties without the support of a full unit. In military circles, these reports often got buried in the fog of war, but within Company B, Hayes's feat spread like wildfire. Men who had doubted his methods now listened, learned, and adapted. Roofs were no longer hazards, they were opportunities. Elevation was no longer a novelty, it was a tactical consideration. Hayes himself did not linger in triumph. He moved quickly to check the positions behind the farmhouse, to ensure no wounded remained exposed, to assist any survivors. The efficiency of the action did not diminish the horror, the cost, or the reality of what had just transpired. He had killed 19 enemy soldiers, each a human life. But war did not allow for the luxury of sentimentality. Every action was measured in survival and mission success. Every choice was a balance of risk and necessity. The battlefield judged no one for conscience. It only responded to results. By mid-morning, Company B had reorganized. Commanders began marking new observation points, noting the advantages of elevated positions, and revising movement protocols. Hayes's actions were not written into doctrine immediately. That process would take months, years even. But a precedent had been set. A single American soldier, armed with intuition, skill, and audacity, had altered the way the United States Army approached urban and semi-urban engagement. Elevation, angles, and unconventional positioning became subjects of discussion. Hayes's rooftop would become a model, an example of how instinct and experience could save lives in ways manuals never imagined. And for Hayes, the day ended as quietly as it began. Snow continued to drift across the Ardennes Forest, concealing the traces of battle under its pale blanket. He checked his rifle, slung it over his shoulder, and walked toward his unit. His eyes scanned the tree line, as always, anticipating the next movement, calculating the next threat. The Germans had learned, eventually, that the unexpected could be lethal. But Hayes had already moved forward. His mind, body, and instincts were a weapon far beyond the reach of doctrine. And the war, in that brief moment, had taught everyone who watched, sometimes the rules exist to be broken. As dusk fell over the Ardennes Forest, the wind carried a brittle silence through the shattered landscape. The bodies of 19 German soldiers lay in a frozen tableau, a grim testimony to the skill and courage of a single man. Hayes moved along the edge of the farmhouse, checking the perimeter, ensuring that no one remained exposed. Each step reminded him of the delicate balance between instinct and danger, a lesson he had learned long before the army ever called his name. The commanders finally gathered near the building, their faces pale, hands trembling slightly from adrenaline and disbelief. For hours, they had dismissed his tin roof theory as reckless, impossible, and dangerous. Yet now, standing before the undeniable proof of his ingenuity, they could not deny its effectiveness. Every trajectory, every fallen enemy, every delay in their advance told a story no manual could teach. The same officers who had laughed were now quietly discussing how to integrate elevated positions into future operations, taking careful notes, silently acknowledging that this day had redefined small unit tactics. Hayes himself avoided any praise or attention. He had never sought recognition. His purpose had always been to survive, protect his comrades, and accomplish the mission. He walked through the remnants of battle, offering assistance where he could, pulling soldiers from mud, covering retreating men, and silently observing the landscape for remaining threats. The forest itself seemed to respect him now, the snow reflecting the pale orange glow of sunset across rooftops that he had once considered only obstacles. Those obstacles were now vantage points, opportunity, and survival. Word of his feat spread quickly through Company B. Soldiers who had doubted him, who had dismissed him as reckless, now whispered his name in awe. Tales of the sniper on the tin roof became legend among those who witnessed it firsthand. The image of a lone rifleman perched high above the tree line, systematically halting an entire enemy squad, resonated with every man who had survived by following him. Strategy, doctrine, and discipline mattered, but courage, intuition, and unconventional thinking mattered even more. Even beyond Company B, Hayes' actions resonated. Intelligence reports from German units noted an unidentified sniper whose position defied logic. The enemy officers puzzled over the precise number of casualties inflicted from an elevated roof, a position they had never expected to be used by Americans. While these reports were buried in classified files for decades, the echoes of that day influenced tactical studies, later shaping how the U.S. Army approached urban and semi-urban combat scenarios. Rooftops, attics, and other overlooked angles became training points for soldiers who might one day face enemies in similar terrain. By nightfall, Hayes finally sat against the cold stone wall near the farmhouse, rifle across his knees, staring at the snow-dusted landscape. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion. Yet even in fatigue, his mind remained alert, analyzing every detail, every movement, every choice that had saved lives. He had trusted instinct over doctrine, skill over protocol, and observation over rigid rules, and that trust had resulted in a victory that could not be quantified in numbers alone. 19 soldiers had fallen. Countless others had been spared because a single man dared to see the battlefield differently. In the days and weeks that followed, Hayes continued to lead by example. His methods were cautiously incorporated into training exercises. Elevated positions, unconventional angles, and the principle of unpredictability began to gain recognition as legitimate tactical advantages. Veterans of that engagement recounted the lesson repeatedly. Manuals could guide, but experience and creativity could save lives. Hayes' story became more than a single act of heroism. It became a blueprint for adaptability, resourcefulness, and courage under fire. And though history often celebrates generals, strategy, and large-scale victories, the truth of that day rested with a single young man from Pittsburgh. On a tin roof in the freezing Ardennes winter, Vincent Hayes had rewritten the rules, not with orders or doctrine, but with intuition, skill, and an unwavering will to survive. The snow continued to fall softly over the Ardennes Forest, covering the traces of battle in its pale, silent blanket. But the lesson endured. Sometimes the battlefield rewards those who think beyond the manual, move beyond the expected, and act with fearless conviction. Hayes had been that man, and for every soldier who survived that day, he was more than a sniper. He was proof that ingenuity, courage, and instinct could triumph where convention failed. In the end, the tin roof was more than a vantage point. It was a testament, a monument to a soldier who saw the battlefield differently, who trusted his experience, and who, for a fleeting yet decisive moment, changed the course of a fight and perhaps the way the army thought about warfare forever.